Good afternoon. Welcome to the August 23rd, 2010 Historic Preservation Commission of Glendale hearing. Our chair, Ruben Amirian, couldn't be present today, so per our policy, we're going to have to elect a chair pro tem. I offer this up to our commissioners.
Make a motion to have Commissioner Desiree be the chair today.
Move Desiree Shire as chair.
I second.
We have a second? Chair Shire, the show is yours.
Walk me through what I do.
We just have to...
We did change the slide.
Yeah. Cool.
say good afternoon. Today is the Historic Preservation Commission, such and such. Then you'll go through the reporting, the posting, the agenda.
Okay, welcome. Today is the meeting of the Historic Preservation. The date today is August 23rd, around 2 o'clock, in the year of 2010. May I ask for the roll call?
Commissioner Amirian, Commissioner Amirian, Commissioner Mardian,
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan,
Here.
Commissioner Shire,
Yes.
and Commissioner Vidor.
Yes.
Now we can see. Thank you. Now we can see.
Wake up call.
Yeah. It was so moody and evocative before. But.
Yeah.
Okay, the next item is the report was posted for this agenda on or before Tuesday, August 17th, 2010, on the bulletin board outside City Hall. Regarding the approval of the minutes for July 26th, 2010, were there any comments on the minutes?
The minutes look good to me, but I just wanted to point out that I had made an error on item number 5, that the anniversary date is actually the 16th of September, so that was correctly recorded, but I made a mistake in speaking at the meeting, so I just wanted to point that out.
Now, this is about the doctor's house, or this
Yes,
is
about the
okay? So that's
doctor's
on the
house.
agenda for today, and then it's
Okay.
item 5 on the.
So we can mention that later then.
Yes.
Okay.
So.
Any other comments?
No.
The only thing I saw was on page 3. Recess says it was called at 4:51, and hearing resumed at 5:05, yet the meeting adjourned, I believe, at 4:54, so I think it should be an hour earlier for both of those.
That's a good call. That was picky.
It just felt like that.
Yeah, it felt longer, I guess, than it really was. That's all I had. Anyone want to make a...
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes with the corrections.
A second.
Commissioner Mardian,
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan,
Yes.
Commissioner Shire,
Yes.
and Commissioner Vidor.
Yes.
Okay, next on the agenda is oral communications. The discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is limited to 5 minutes. The commission may question the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. Do we have anyone for other items of business? I don't believe so. Okay. Number 5 on the agenda, comments from the commissioners.
I have a comment, Madam Chair. As you all know, I had the opportunity to go to Grand Rapids, Michigan. I just wanted to share some of the issues that came up in the workshops that I've attended. I'll mention a few of them to you, and you can take it under your, however you feel about them.
Okay.
One of the items is the Commission should always come to consensus in making decisions. The other item is reviewing for designation. The review should be based on the merits and how it relates to the criteria of the city ordinance, not just the way you feel about the building, or you like it, whether it's pretty or not. You cannot judge it that way for a designation. And I thought that was very interesting. I think in our city, I think we're ahead in most of the issues that they discuss, especially the way we run our meetings. I think we do 90% of the work that other cities are doing throughout the nation. And I strongly encourage every one of you, if you get the opportunity, to go to that convention. I believe it's a 3-4 day event, but you'll get a lot of insight as what the other parts of the country are doing in preservation. There they talk about 1,000 home districts, 1,500 home districts, where we're talking about much lesser number, and I thought that was amazing. With that, I really encourage you to visit the conference that happens, I believe, twice a year?
No, it's only once every 2 years.
Once, I'm sorry, yeah. That's, and that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for going.
Yeah, thank you for going.
And on the issue of consensus that was brought up, I've heard that from other panels and people talk about that, and I just want to make it clear it's by no means necessary, and it's nothing standard in preservation that you strive for consensus. There are going to be issues that we're not all going to agree on, and the commission can vote however, each commissioner sees fit. So it's an interesting idea, but I don't think it should be presented the way they may have there, where it's like something to strive toward only because,
I think the point was there to keep commissioners out of court. That's they had the whole section. Yeah.
I see.
Risk management.
Yes.
Management, not everybody needs to be unanimously in agreement. Okay.
I think we have a good track record, and we do a lot of decisions. We all come, but we have few cases that we have disagreed. So I think it's healthy to disagree sometimes.
But the second item you brought up about having our comments and thoughts be based on criteria probably would help with maybe getting more towards consensus on some of that.
And we actually have a discussion kind of about that scheduled for today, so we'll kind of hit that, strangely enough. So.
The only other comment, or do you have any comments?
No, well, I do have a comment, but it has to do with Rockhaven. And is that at all under our purview, Rockhaven? I would just like to know what's going on.
Yeah, Rockhaven isn't designated, but as the preservation planner for the city, I've been very involved. Alan Loomis has been involved, and the Parks Department has kind of authority over the site right now. But we've definitely been involved through the historic assessment that was made, the landscape assessment, and then future issues there we'll definitely be involved in. But the commission will probably be bringing things to the commission as we have for kind of informational purposes. But at this point, it's not a designated site, so. You have a specific...
Well, no, just an update more than anything else.
Yeah, and I haven't gotten an update for a while. I don't know.
Perhaps we can ask the Parks Department to come in and just give us an update on what's happening, just as an informational item.
Madam Chair, I had one comment, if I may. Wanted to ask Joe, what's the status on the Sealy building? I had some community member ask me about that.
Yeah, the Sealy building has actually come back. Their permits and drawings had expired. They've come back, and the drawings were restamped. They solved their financing issues. They had some issues with one of the construction loans, and so that's been solved. So we expect now that the drawings have been restamped, and I'm not sure if it's gone through everything at Building and Safety, but on our end, the current planner, Roger Kiesel, and myself stamped everything. So it's moving through the process. Hopefully work starts again there soon.
Thank you.
And Commissioner Vidor, this would be a good time for you to reiterate the Doctor's House date,
yes.
just so people know, and then we can vote on it later.
Yes, I had indicated that the 30th anniversary of the moving of the house was coming up, and I inadvertently had the wrong date, and someone in the community corrected me that the actual anniversary date is the 16th of September, and that's the appropriate date, so I would like to change that.
And the last comment actually is one that I had. I wanted to see if we could request from staff a list of the Mills Act items that any residents need to do by a certain year. as 2010 is coming to, a close. If there's any work for those contracts that needed to be done, it probably would need to be in here shortly for a review for them to do the work prior to. And maybe we don't have any for 2010, but if we could keep an ongoing list.
Yeah, we have a garage door that's expected to go in by the end of the year. That's the only one on this year's list, but I'll put together a whole list, and I think we've talked about that being a kind of a running list that you can always have in your agenda packs so that you always know where things are on that.
That'd be great.
We'll have that for you next month.
Okay.
And I just have one comment on the two items that you mentioned that you had taken back from the convention.
Ms. Vidor, if I may, before we start commenting on comments, that sort of ventures into the territory of discussing things that are not on the agenda.
Oh,
so just
okay.
as a word of caution, if we want to discuss it, maybe we should agendize it for next month's meeting.
I'll well, I guess this would be my comment then. All right. With regard to the evaluation of landmarks based on merit, I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's great to continue to evaluate and look at and revisit the landmark ordinance to make sure that the criteria are clear and up-to-date and concise, and that we're able to all, as individuals, assess each landmark application on its merits as things evolve and architecture evolves.
And again, at the end of the hearing, we'll be going over all the criteria and then a discussion of some previous commission discussions so that we can look at that. And so we'll do that after our at the end of new business. So.
Okay, any further comments? Okay, we move on to number 6, old business, which I guess we have none.
None?
Okay, number 7, new business. Item A, 2096 Rim Crest Drive, Glendale Register nomination. And I believe I have one request for a speaker.
Yeah, after I do my presentation, and then if you have any questions for me as a commission, and then we open it to the public.
Okay.
So I have the pleasure of introducing you to 2096 Rim Crest Drive, which is in the Brockmont neighborhood. When you look at the hills, the Verdugo Hills of Glendale from down here in the flatlands, and you look up, this is one of the streets that is kind of perched highest up on the hill, and it's on a south-facing downslope. And it's rare that we say that, a building is unique in Glendale, but we really don't have a lot of residential structures that have this kind of architectural character, the attention to detailing and use of materials that we see here. This is the Rice House, built by Chuck and Phyllis Rice. The design is by Gerald Lomax, and there's information in the nomination packet about Mr. Lomax, and I'll go over a little bit about his career in a minute. But we have determined, based on his position in the kind of architectural spectrum of Southern California and California architecture, that he really does seem to play a really important role that's kind of gone under the radar. So he's not one of our name brand starchitects that everyone is familiar with, but when we look at his body of work and who he worked for, this house really seems to fit into an important story that his career can tell us about an aspect of Southern California architecture. The Rices were longtime friends of Lomax and knew that they wanted to work with him at some point when they found the right site. If the commissioners have had a chance to visit this site, you realize it has some of the most spectacular views that we have anywhere in Glendale. And so in working with this fairly steeply sloped site, Lomax and the Rices kind of shared kind of an attention to detail and almost kind of perfectionism that led to this product that really stands out in the neighborhood, obviously, because it's surrounded by kind of Mediterranean, kind of neo-Mediterranean houses from the 80s and 90s. So in keeping with the modern idiom, similar to the house that we saw on Romulus Drive last month, this house kind of turns a blank face toward the street. So here we see two street facades. The upper one is an earlier picture before the landscaping grew in, where you can really see the forms, and the lower photo is a current photograph. And you see there are really no windows directly facing the street. And in the case of this house, it's almost a very kind of brutal facade with the concrete, but that brutality and the heaviness is leavened by the play of volumes and the open kind of sunshade at the top over the entry area. as well as the landscaping. And what's interesting about this house, and I don't have a good photo that shows it in the context of the neighborhood, but the massing of the house, given kind of its heavy, blocky massing, really doesn't stand, it stands out by its style, but it doesn't overwhelm its neighbors. It fits into the neighborhood in a very interesting way. This is a set of drawings that Mr. Lomax did for the house. I wanted to draw your attention to this one over here on the left side, just so you get a sense of its form. Rim Crest Drive is over on the right side of the drawing, and the house is really set up in three component parts. There's the front part of the house that faces the street that's made out of the cast-in-place concrete, which is amazingly refined in its detailing, and it establishes the module of the square that you see throughout the house, linking the main living quarters of the house to these kind of secondary bedrooms and service spaces, as well as the garage down at the bottom, is this glass atrium that's almost completely glass. It's got some minimal steel framing, but the two walls are almost completely glass, as well as the ceiling. And then this links to the third wing, which is basically another glass wing that's surrounded by incredibly robust, heavy steel beams that give it a structural quality that you just really don't see in domestic architecture, not just in Glendale, but pretty much anywhere. Once you come into the house from the street, you enter this kind of entry court that's slightly below grade, and it establishes some of the themes that we're going to see, which is kind of a simple material palette, but a really refined and exquisitely detailed material palette. At the center here, you have the stainless steel door, which again establishes this idea of very tall doors. This house has some of the tallest doors I've seen in town. You come into this private entry court, and then you enter the house through these glass doors to the right. This is the back of the concrete street volume, so that you see the concrete aspect of it wraps the entire structure. And this is the pool deck. This area here is the backside of the garage. And here you see, over at the upper left, this is the atrium, which serves as the dining room, as well as kind of space for stairways and kind of movement between the two wings. And then here's the living room wing at the lower floor, the master bedroom suite at the top. And this is where we have this heavy steel framing that really forms kind of an exoskeleton around this part of the building, with the delicate and refined glass and the very beautiful kind of steel mullions set back behind this external framework. The site is relatively small given the slope, so it was a relatively small buildable area. One of the things I enjoy most was the orthogonal geometry of the house, demands these right angles, and when the patio kind of demanded to kind of come out, it kind of cantilevers out over the hill to keep the geometry of the house as pure as possible. Even some of there really aren't secondary spaces in a work like this, which was truly designed as a total piece of architecture. This is kind of a dining atrium that is formed in the outdoor area between the steel wing and the concrete wing that would be to the left. And then one of the things that impressed me most is when you come around to the side of the house, which is really the back of the house, facing a retaining wall in the neighbor, you have the same level of detailing and use of materials that you have at the rest of the house. So that's a very impressive aspect of the Rice's and Mr. Lomax's attention to detail. And I'm sorry for the quality of this. This is a scan from one of the many magazine publications that have featured this house, but it just kind of shows the context, where we're looking at a house that is, somewhat alien, but also sort of fits in an interesting way through just really careful design, I would say. And here's a view out toward downtown Los Angeles. The current owner, the owners are Vahe and Ida Yegivarian, and they say on a clear day, which I didn't have the pleasure of seeing it on a clear day, you can see Catalina from the site. So it's really kind of a special part of Glendale to have that opportunity. Gerald Lomax is one of these, like I said, under-the-radar architects, and the more you learn about him, the more you realize he's really had an intriguing, interesting career. He's still alive, working in Monterey now. A few years ago, he was featured in an exhibit for his 80th birthday that put out a lovely little book featuring his works, and we can share that with the commissioners. We only had one copy, but if you want to leaf through that, it's kind of fun. And here are just a few of his kind of iconic works. early in his career, he went to work after graduating from school in Texas for Craig Elwood. And Craig Elwood, of the early LA modernists, is the one who was most influenced by Mies van der Rohe, and Gerald Lomax also came out of school very interested in Mies's career. And Elwood himself wasn't a registered architect, so he had designers in his firm who were really doing a lot of the work, and that's something that's only come out in recent years. Elwood was a master marketer, and he really got a lot of commissions for his firm, which was always a relatively small firm. But he ultimately took a lot of credit for the work. So a lot of things that I would have once said, this is a Craig Elwood house based on other publications, we're now able to say was really the work of Gerald Lomax. This is the Hunt House in Malibu from 1954. This is case study house number 18 in Beverly Hills. So we're working with a case study architect who actually had one of the built case study houses. And he ended up coming to Glendale at one point. And then this is Lomax's own house from 1970 in West Hollywood. And you could just see there's an attention to, incredible crisp detailing and a real commitment to kind of modernist aesthetics, especially influenced by Mies. In reviewing this property, we went through all of the criteria, and the owners nominated it as a property associated with a significant person. And at first, I wasn't sure that Gerald Lomax would fit into that quality. But the more I read and looked at the various articles that were submitted as part of the application package, at staff level, I became convinced that he is an architect that we don't see all that often working in Glendale. This is his only work that we know of, and I believe we can say it's his only work in Glendale. But based on his importance regionally, I think we can say that this is associated with someone whose significance kind of extends beyond Glendale, and it's interesting to have his work in the city. And then under Criterion D, where we're looking at this is our famous split criterion with the two components. In this case, we believe that it meets both of these parts of the criteria. One of the best remaining architectural types in the neighborhood, just because in this neighborhood, where there are some other very nice modern houses, there are no modern houses quite like this one. And then it's also what I would say an exemplary example through its design, its craftsmanship, and its materials. In the staff report, I focused a bit on its period of construction because it brings us to the question that we've been discussing as a commission over the last few months about how old does a property have to be to get on the Glendale Register. The design for this house began in the late 80s, and it wasn't completed until 1993, so we use 1993 as its official construction date. Generally, as we've talked about, we need enough time to lapse so that we can kind of place a property in its context and understand its relationship to the architectural and social and cultural history of the city. Because this house is such a unique example at such a high caliber, in staff's opinion, this is one of the reasons we don't want to have a cutoff date, and this is where the commission can consider whether they think the commission thinks enough time has elapsed. But in staff's opinion, this is such an outstanding work, and we're so pleased that the Yegezarians have, nominated it to the Glendale Register that we really want to, strongly support the nomination. So, if you have any questions, that's the end of the presentation.
I have a question, Madam Chair. Now, this application doesn't have a Mills Act attached.
No, as of today, the applicant has submitted a Mills Act application.
Okay.
But the city attorney says we'll have to bring that back to the commission to consider that. So for now, you're just considering this as a Glendale Register application.
Now, second question, you said it meets both parts of the criteria D. Is that what your interpretation?
Yeah, and I only say the beginning of criteria D, the best example, which we're usually very kind of reluctant to ever use. In this case, this is one of the few properties where we can say there's not a lot, if anything, like this, not just in the neighborhood, but anywhere in the city. I'm pretty comfortable using that one in this case.
Okay. Last question, Madam Chair. You mentioned in the report under Gerald Lomax's background, now some of these peoples were my instructors, Raymond Cappy and all. It's a quite a hypothetical question. I don't know if you can answer me or not. Any of these homes here, of their homes, aside from John Luthner, have been designated?
Well, they're all in different cities.
Well, I understand.
Yeah, so
I mean, just if you have if you can
I
answer.
can't say for sure, so.
Because I know
The quality of the company he keeps in that exhibit, where this was the LA12 exhibit from 1977, I think. I don't know if you have it there. But the, Frank Gehry, Charles Gwathmey, Anthony Lumsden, Ray Cappy, Caesar Pelli, Frank Gehry, and then Craig Elwood also was part of it. So he was kind of singled out among these dozen architects as representing something special about LA architecture.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got one request to speak. Mr. Gagazarian.
My name is Bahe Yegizarian. By now I live at 2096 Rim Crest Drive, and I want to thank you for the opportunity given to make this home part of the historical homes of the city of Glendale. I think the project speaks for itself, and as the architect Gerald Lomax itself says, he doesn't do too much promotion of his works. Basically, he allows his works to speak for itself. This is probably why we haven't heard too much of his name, but as time goes by, I think he will become more and more famous, not only through California, but United States and all around the world. We bought this house about 10 years ago, year 2000, and we've been enjoying living in this house since then. Not because it's just we have a nice and warm family, just because the house itself, it offers so much. If we get a chance an evening with all the lights on, standing around the house and enjoying ourselves, you will realize all of a sudden how much the impact that property can bring to you and how much attention can take away from you. One thing that it's important, every time I see the house, even seeing here in the pictures, it attracts me. It turns me on. Not because it's my house, because it's a piece of jewelry, sincerely. And I hope today the Commission will go for it, because the main reason is to protect any good quality of work that we have in the city. Apart from the age, apart from whether traditional or it's modern. In fact, it's good that we have all kinds and we can appreciate all types of architectural homes. Gerald Lomax works has been published, at least since we bought this house. I've been paying very much attention of his works, and I have seen numerous of his works has been published in so many different, including Architectural Digest. At least since we bought the house, I've seen four of his projects, meaning that he has a coverage. And this particular house, to me, it seems, maybe I'm prejudiced or not, I don't know, but it seems like it speaks to me even more because I have seen some of his other projects as well. The reason, and this very project alone has been in Architectural Digest, and it has been in GA Houses, as you know, it's not an American, it's not a commercial, it's just a pure architectural magazine coming from Japan. We have steel, let me just... This is steel profile, is also in Australian publication by the architects of Australia, that is also speaks 4 or 5 pages in this particular publication about the property. And of course, there are others. The property has won also 3 awards, 1 AIA award, and 2 national award as an architecture quality. What this particular project to me, and like I said, maybe I don't want to be talking about it too much, but it's interesting when I read through the articles of different magazines, the relationship, as Jay had brought up here, is their relationship and the uniqueness and commonality of the both builder owner, who was Rice himself, and Gerald Lomax. And I would like to read a couple pieces of their sayings in these publications regarding the emphasis that they have put on to detail and finish work and perfectionism. I don't know how much time I have, but I'd like to read a couple of things here, if you don't mind.
You're okay?
Am I okay? Okay. In Architectural Digest, says Chuck Rice, "We ground every weld until it was super smooth. A particular finish did not come out right. We stripped it down and did it over until it satisfied us. We fixed things no one but us and Jerry would ever notice." And in the very same Architectural Digest, Lomax speaks and says, "I doubt I will ever have another client who is fanatical as I am. We agreed on the basic design in few weeks, but it took us a cosmic stretch of time to translate the conception to a reality that met our exacting standards." In the same context, I'd just like to read another piece from LA Times. Rice says, "He acted as his owner general contractor, and steel finishes were done by workers who usually refinish Ferraris and Maseratis. These guys do flawless precision work, and so the exposed steel of the house is as smooth as your piano." Lomax comments, "The Rice house is really a special because Chuck Rice was my good friend, and we shared the same goals, and he was willing and able to build it the best way it could be built. That is a rare combination to find." In modern homes, this is very important to pay attention to the linings and details. And the reason I read these two pieces is just to show that, in spite of Lomax has being very detail-oriented and very perfectionist himself, I shouldn't say very perfectionist, but perfectionist himself, adding the builder-owner or contractor on top of it, it had created even better yet product. I have to say his previous website of Lomax used to be the interior design of 2096 Rim Crest Drive, meaning saying that he himself also values the property built in Glendale as one of his great works. With respect to him, to me, all of his works are great, but this is one of the better ones yet. So, with all due respect, this was my thinking that as a modern home, but yet very detailed craftsmanship, it should be preserved and should be part of homes to maintain for a few generations to come and enjoy a good quality property like this being built. One little thing, if I can add, when I was reading the Architectural Digest and referring to allow me. Mice van der Rohe, the house, Farnsworth House, of course, the writer here Whiteson is trying to compare this house with the house that Vanner Rowe had designed and built in Illinois. Very recently, when I was Googling this article, I realized that this house now is in the preservation and historical homes of the Illinois Chicago. Because sometimes we think it's hard when we hear historical and it's new, modern, very new-aged home, this debate or understanding whether this should apply or not. So I thought, just to let you know, when I Googled it, I found out that this is in the historical, and I have a copy of that. If you like, I can give it to you. Again, thank you for your time, and I appreciate your great presentation of the project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, then we'll close the public hearing and open up to discussion among the commissioners. Would anyone like to start?
We'll start our darling today.
Start on
Arlene.
this end.
Listen.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Yazarian and Jay, for a really nice, comprehensive report. This application triggered in me so much excitement and questions, and it just very interesting, and of course it provokes a lot of interesting questions about the meaning of historical, and so I thought a lot about it, and I will say that I've been exposed to this house before. I did actually serve as a docent on a tour of the house, so I got to learn a little bit about Mr. Lomax's background and the architectural features of the house when I did that, but I learned more reading the report and then looking at the articles, and I think for me the question is, well, what is historical? And when I look at the reputation of Mr. Lomax, and I know he's not a household word, but that, maybe he will be someday, because he's certainly amongst architectural experts and historians and scholars, he seems to be a famous person, or at least very well known in his field. And also his association with Craig Elwood in the Los Angeles Case Study Program, and of course the beautiful and very artistic detailing, design, siting, massing of this house, not to mention the craftsmanship and the way it stands out in such an extraordinary manner, not only in the neighborhood but in Glendale, that for me, there's no way I can't say it isn't historical. And I realize that, 93? Okay, so it's coming up on 20 years, which isn't very long. But then the question is, in the context of Los Angeles and the modernist movement, which we're known for, really how much time is historical? And this, piece of architecture here is, it's a great architect, a great modernist architect's later work. It's representative of a great mid-century architect's later work. So it's kind of a millennial transitional piece, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's taking us from the 20th century and the great architectural achievements of that century into the new century. And so I think it's monumentally historical. And I would be thrilled and honored to be able to vote yes to have this house be a landmark. And I'd be really proud of the commission if we did it. Intent. So that's what I have to say. I just have one hiccup comment, and that is, and I know there's debate about this all the time, but there are elements, especially in the center glass box of the house, that are on the inside of the house that really do lend to the architectural distinction of the house. And so I think when we're looking at later 20th century and new architecture, which we will certainly be looking at in the future, we need to think about opting in some features that blur the lines and distinction between exterior and interior. So having said that, I realize we don't have that, but I'm thrilled about this house being nominated as a landmark.
Did you just coin a new style name?
What?
Millennial transitional?
Okay.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
Go ahead, Ms. Moore.
Well, I have to say that it is historical. You know when you see it. I mean, it doesn't have to be 50 years. Even the 19, 20 years that it is, you know. I mean, I know it when I see it, and looking at it, I would hate to have anything happen to this house. It may be not at 50 years, but I would love to see it preserved so that it would meet the 50-year point. It really is the kind of house, though, that, like Commissioner Vidor said, that you really have to go inside and take a look at it. You don't really get a sense of what a magnificent house it is. It's designed in all the features unless you get to go inside. So I think there should be something where you can judge a house, a modernistic house, more from the inside also than just the outside itself. I mean, I think it meets it definitely with its as outstanding or exemplary architectural design, details, materials, or craftsmanship of a particular period. I think it fits all of that, and I think it should be on our list. So.
Thank you.
I actually been discussing the age limit for quite some time, and let me go back and share my experience in this house. When I first had the opportunity to see this house was in the tour offered by the Historical Society, and I haven't thought of a house that attracted me most on this one. When they say Rim Crest, I said, Rim Crest is that whole new development with a lot of, criticism over the years. So if I finally got there, when I saw it from outside, although the design of this house indicative of that period where the facade is less, very simple, but in this particular case has different proportions. And I was very excited to go inside for the first time. And my first reaction was, wow, and I'm looking at these details and the crispiness, like Mr. Yagazarian was mentioning, the sharpness of the details overwhelmed me. It's truly overwhelmed me. And not also overwhelmed me for a long time, then I said, I would really like to see somebody come close to this house. But I left it at that. And a while went back, somebody mentioned, how do you feel about a modern building with that caliber? And I knew they were talking about this building. And I said, I don't know until I see it more in detail. So I had the opportunity again over the weekend to see this house. And I was very excited to go see it again with a different perspective. And I was amazed. Because my first reaction when I first saw this house with a tour, and I said to my mind, is this Mies van der Rohe influence or Le Corbusier? So I wasn't quite sure which one. Then I forgot about it. Then when you send me this report and I'm looking at it, they both were influenced, I believe, both Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. And I think they were part of the great movement of modern architecture. And to see them mentioned under some of these names, it even overwhelms me further. And I want to thank Mr. and Mrs. Yagazarian for bringing this application. I think this house needs to be left alone the way it is with no alteration. And I was shocked to see in the report also no alteration or additions or any sort of work has been done on this house. And I appreciate that, especially in this kind of architecture. This architecture should not be disturbed. It should be left alone. It has its own period, and it's superior to anything around Glendale and modernism, I believe. There's no one house like this in Glendale. And for that reason, I'm very supportive of this application, although it goes against my thinking process of what's historical. But in this case, it's a particular case. I don't think you'll see it anywhere in town, and I want to see it protected the way it is. But I would suggest that, I'm not there whether I could say it or not to apply for the Mills Act.
Yeah, we have an application as of today, so we'll see that again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I definitely concur with the comments of my colleagues, and I definitely appreciate the boldness of the owners, especially if you've been hearing our past commission meetings on the age limits and restrictions, and should we put an age restriction on that. I think it's very bold of you to come forward because you have such a passion about the home and you realize it's something that should be protected. I was just in awe as entering the house because as I mentioned, as I saw you over the weekend, that I walked by there, and very ominous space, and to the street you don't see 1/10 of what the house offers. And it is, like you said, a jewelry box. And the way the steel and glass fit together with the concrete and the views are just spectacular. We could see all the way to Catalina, and it was just unbelievable. And I agree with my fellow commissioners that it should be protected and preserved. And as I was thinking more over the weekend about our past discussions, I just wrote a few comments as we wrestle with, what's historical and what is this Historic Preservation Commission about. I wrote down, it's really preserving current noteworthy structures for tomorrow's history. So although we have some that are definitely historic and have been around for, 80 years or so, some of those that need to be around for the next 80 years, we need to protect today, regardless of age. So I would definitely go along with recommending that this be on the register. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I had a comment. It's interesting. This is a test for us. This is one of the newest buildings that we have. And I'm curious to see what City Council's reaction is on this one.
Yeah.
Because we are not the final body, of course.
right.
That's right.
So, it's interesting, but again, this is one of a kind.
It is.
There a motion?
I'll make a motion to recommend this to City Council to designate as a local resource.
Oh, I second.
Very symbolic, Commissioner Mardian.
Very.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm even shocked at myself.
we will remind you all the
I was
time.
actually contemplating until I got here. That's why the question came up, are these guys also have homes that are designated? I knew you couldn't answer that question, but I thought I'd try.
You've just given me a heads up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Monsieur, by the way. We appreciate your
Yes.
commitment for this house, and we like to see it as is. Thank you.
Roll call.
Commissioner Margin.
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan.
Enthusiastically, yes.
Commissioner Vidor.
Yes,
Chair Shire.
Yes.
Congratulations, sir.
congratulations.
Thank you very much.
You made history today.
Yes, you did.
Good.
Youngest approval.
Okay, now we're on to item 7B, consideration of a proposal to request that the City Council declare September 16th, 2010 as Doctor's House Day in honor of the 30-year anniversary of the property's restoration.
This is based on Commissioner Vidor's having raised this at the last meeting, and there was a vote to put it on the agenda. And staff certainly supports the idea of having a Doctor's House Day, and I think it's up for your discussion and vote. So,
Well, maybe since I brought it forward, I should explain why I thought it was a good idea. I think the Doctor's House, although it may not be, exemplary of our historic housing stock. I mean, let's face it, how many Victorian homes do we have? Which is one of the reasons it was preserved, but it also was an early important house because of the people who lived in it. But I think the most important thing in recognizing is that the saving of the house and the restoration really triggered a new last quarter of the century movement to look at preservation and think about how we treat our historic landmarks. So it's symbolic in a way as an important trigger point for re-engaging the community in historic preservation. So that was my rationale.
Any other comments? I just had one question. Is that to be nominated this day every year? Like continuing September 16th? Or just for
I thought it was
this
for the
year?
anniversary.
I think we meant it to be for the anniversary, at
One-time
least.
anniversary.
Yes, because it's, maybe on landmark anniversaries like 50 or something, but 30 is pretty good, and it's the first major anniversary of the millennium, so.
And part of the commission's discussion, we can arrange to find space on a city council agenda to do this, but you might want to discuss among yourselves if you think it's appropriate for a commissioner to make the request, or if you want staff to do that, or how you'd like it to be done. So,
I think the commission should make the request,
Yes, I think so.
in my opinion.
Yeah.
Then
Then-
part of your discussion you can choose among yourselves, or you can all go.
Maybe it should be the staff person of the commission or
Oh, you
the
mean-
chair of the commission.
Oh, do you mean that someone presents this at City Council
Yes,
versus
yes,
us
someone
determining
will-
that the commission in general is bringing it, but you could speak to...
Yeah, on behalf of the commission, we're requesting, or would it just be a designation at staff level, Alan?
I think there are a couple of ways you could handle it. On the one hand, I think the commission should at least vote or by consensus determine that you're in favor of doing this as a commission. And then secondly, you can decide whether you would like to ask one of the commissioners to attend that city council day on behalf of the commission to make this request that the council designate September 16th as Doctor's House Day. Alternatively, you could simply ask staff to put it on the calendar and let it go to the council that way. But I think it would probably be symbolic if one of the commissioners came on behalf of the commission, since it would seem you're going to make a vote as a commission to make this request to council.
Madam Chair, can we make a vote today? And when the item comes up for City Council, you can remind us, and we'll
If you
choose
vote-
who comes or who goes there, or...
Yeah, if you vote today, then we'll work with city clerk to kind of find an agenda slot for this. And then, assuming we'll try to get a city council hearing as close to the 16th as possible, and then they can possibly have a proclamation or something else declaring the day.
Madam Chair, may I ask, what did we do the last time? We had something similar from the Historical Society for...
And that's
What
what
was that?
it seems to me, if I recall different declarations of things, that a council member does it, and then stakeholders, such as in this case, the Historic Preservation Commission and people from the community who are directly involved, show up and kind of symbolically accept it on behalf of the community. But isn't it usually a council person who
That's
does?
the day of when the proclamation's made. And I actually have a question. I'm not sure that we need to go to council publicly to ask for this to happen, or if it's something that can be arranged, and then they would have Doctor's House Day declared.
I think the commission is making a request, the council designates it. Now, whether it's a procedural issue, we'd have to clear with the city clerk. I think it's entirely possible that sometime before September 16th, when the council does their declarations and proclamations, they could simply say, put it on the agenda, and then one of the commissioners or all the commissioners or representatives of the community could be available to receive the proclamation.
For example, when May was declared Historic Preservation Month, we didn't go to the council first to ask them to do that. It was done through the city clerk's office. I imagine this would be the same.
I think
but
this would be the same way.
I'm not sure.
But regardless, I think it would be useful today if the commission would decide who we would like to see, who would be the representative of the commission. I think typically our first phone call would be to the chair of the commission. That's one of the responsibilities of being the chair, is to represent the chair at council meetings. So in this case, we'd be calling Mr. Amirian.
And that doesn't preclude anybody else on the commission from going.
Absolutely not.
So.
Or the chair could ask a fellow commissioner to go. So.
Okay.
So do we need a motion about that, or
Yeah, if you could just make a quick motion and vote.
we'll make a motion?
I'll make a motion to designate September 16 as the 30th year anniversary and send this to City Council.
I second.
Oh, you said. Go ahead.
Commissioner Margin,
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan,
Yes.
Commissioner Vidor,
Yes.
and Chair Shire.
Yes. Okay. Next, we have updates and briefings from staff. 8A.
8A. Oh, and I just changed it to 8B mistakenly. Oh, well.
Oh.
No, that was my mistake. I just did that here.
Oh.
I got confused with 7B and, okay. So this is something I just wanted to raise an issue, and it's interesting that Commissioner Mardian brought this up based on his discussions and meetings at the conference in Grand Rapids. But the idea of how do we, and how do you as a commission, and me working at staff level, start assessing properties that are brought to us as possible Glendale Register nominations. And the issue is, looking at things based on the merits, as Commissioner Mardian mentioned, using our set of criteria, and trying to divorce ourselves from kind of a beauty pageant approach of like, this is a pretty house versus this is a beautiful building versus this building actually has some meaning. This tells us part of the story of Glendale in these different ways that meet criteria. And the discussion came up after last month's hearing where there was a split vote, bringing up another issue Mr. Mardian brought up. But we had we had a Glendale Register nomination that there was some kind of difference of opinion on whether it met the criteria or not. I had some discussions individually with commissioners. Alan and I and other staff have talked about the issue. So what I wanted to do today is just kind of bring up some of these issues to just kind of open the subject for commission discussion. I have a few slides to show. I wanted to share with you my staff level decision making as I kind of formulate staff reports and staff recommendations so you have a sense of where I'm coming from. And in no way is this going to be telling the Commission, like, this is how the Commission has to act, because the Commission is a completely independent body. But it's more just a reminder of the importance of the precedent that the Commission can set through its decision-making and where that could lead us in the future. And it's impossible when we're looking at something like this for every decision to be completely objective because there are so many variables. And we're also working with, in general, with the Glendale Register with a smaller pool of applications because we're only having homes and buildings that owners volunteer to bring to us. So we're not really looking at the full spectrum of the architectural and historic heritage of the city. So with those constraints, one thing that came up in the hearing last month was that we had a house that was a contributing structure in a designated historic district. So therefore, under the city's preservation program, it was protected. So it wasn't like a place that we had to worry about anymore the way we might think a house that is outside of a historic district doesn't have any protections until we put it on the Glendale Register. And as a contributing structure in a district, I just wanted to kind of go over what it means to be a contributor and then kind of run through the criteria for Glendale Register status, because they're two very different things. And I think the Commission knows all of this, so this will just serve to open up the discussion. But basically, for a property to be a contributor in a historic district, it needs to have been built within the district's period of significance, and it needs to retain enough integrity, and integrity is a fairly difficult preservation word that's also very controversial for a lot of people. But in general, it means that it has enough physical materiality. It has enough of its materials and original design intact to kind of still tell us what the house or the property meant in the 1920s, the 1930s when it was built and it was used. And it hasn't been altered to such a degree that it wouldn't be recognized by perhaps the original owner or people who were in the house at an early point. So to be a contributing structure in a district is relatively a low threshold compared to what we look for in the Glendale Register. So I wanted to just kind of run down, we've done all of these criteria recently because we've had a few recommendations for denial where applicants actually nominate a house under numerous criteria, and we're trying to kind of honestly share our opinion that indeed we don't think it necessarily meets those. But as I've mentioned before to the Commission, Criterion A really is going to be rare for us to find buildings that meet something that reflects interest or value as part of the city's heritage. That's a building on the caliber of the Alex Theater, the building we're sitting in, the Railroad Depot, buildings that really have played a huge role in many people's lives and in the development of the entire city. Criterion B, we haven't invoked very often, certainly not since I've been here. It would be a significant historic event would have had to occur on the property, and that property would have to still be associated with that event in some way. An example would be the Verdugo Adobe, where the Oak of Peace was, and over the years, other significant things happened there, but something as profound as, the peace treaty being discussed between between the United States and Mexico was, a pretty huge event that affected not just Glendale, but the whole nation. I hope we get some that meet that criterion, but it's not going to be incredibly common. I'm going to skip C and D because those are the ones we're always talking about, and just go to E, which is the unique location or physical characteristic that's an established and familiar visual feature. We have many people say, well, my house is on a corner, and you can see it, and it's very prominent, and when you're driving up the street, it's the first one that you see. To my mind, when I'm kind of reviewing these things, that alone isn't enough, even if it's true. I may have just been happening to look left instead of right when I drove up the street that day. It's like, that's tough. We do have properties like the Brockman Clock Tower, a house that was recently designated on Rosemont that kind of terminates a street and has kind of if you remember, it's 955 Rosemont, I think, kind of a turreted, kind of castle-like appearance, and everyone in the neighborhood had called it the Castle House for decades. So that house really stands out from its neighbors because of its siting and because of some of its architectural features. But again, that criterion we're not going to invoke very often. Criterion F is important for us to have as a commission and in our city preservation ordinance because we often forget how important the archaeological record is to city history. We just haven't encountered anything in years on the commission that goes back to pre-contact archaeological history. We have had a few situations where we look at archaeological reports for more modern 20th century buildings, but generally we don't have any sites that have been designated just for this criterion, but it needs to be there. And then finally, Criterion G's for natural settings that strongly contribute to the well-being of the city. And we've had several people say, well, but my house has a beautiful grove of oaks and a year-round creek running through it, something like that, which makes for a really amazing backyard, but again, isn't something that we're sharing as the city. If someone were to nominate the landscape around the Le Mesnager barn or Brand Park or something, those are the kinds of sites that would fit into this criterion, I think. But so far we haven't seen those. And then going back to our kind of two traditional criteria, I've mentioned many times how for a property to meet Criterion C, I am very careful to make sure that we're looking at all of the people who are written up in the nomination. So we're assuming the research has been done and we know everything we can find out about the property at this time at least. And I really expect that if someone built their own house and they were fairly well off and they ran a business, I'm very impressed that you run a business, you make a family life, you make good, and you build a beautiful house, but you're not necessarily significant because of that. That business or your work needs to have had a broader influence, a broader impact on the city, possibly beyond the city. And I think we've been very careful. One thing we have done, though, which we're doing with the Rice House and we also did with the Block House, in the past, the Commission has named houses after original owners, and in many cases those were speculative houses that were just built by someone and they never lived in the house, they never spent time there, the name just was on the permit history and that became the name of the house. And I always think that's creating a false sense of history, that person really wasn't involved with that property beyond just making the choice to design it, to build it, and to walk away after they sold it. So I'm pretty careful, but we've had two examples recently with the Block House, where Richard Block commissioned his architect and had a lot of input into the design. So it was a house that was built for him, and then he still owns the house and has been a great steward of the house over the years. And then in the case with the Rice House, we recommended that it be called the Rice House, even though the Rices didn't live there for decades, as Richard Block has, but they were deeply involved in the design, in the commissioning of Gerald Lomax, in the discussions they had, and then also Mr. Rice served as a contractor. So all of that amazing detailing you see was the result, as Mr. Yugazarian read some of the quotes, that was his, obsession to make sure those details were there. So both of those properties do meet Criterion C in staff's opinion. Finally, for Criterion D, and this is the one I wanted to focus on today because this is our most commonly, used criterion. And I want to focus on the second part. When we say something's one of the best remaining architectural types in the neighborhood, it's very rare that you're hearing that come out of staff reports and from me. Today's an example where I think we all felt pretty comfortable saying, yeah, this is one of a kind. In general, we're not going to say that about a Spanish colonial revival in most neighborhoods, especially in neighborhoods like Ross Moyne and Cumberland Heights area, and those neighborhoods that just have a wealth of resources of those styles. So that brings us to the second part of the criterion. Someday, I think we're going to propose, after discussions with the Commission, to kind of reword some of these so that they're more clear and more usable. So we're talking about it today based on what we can use right now. But if this discussion leads to kind of ideas from the Commission about how we would change the language for this, we can start that discussion and keep it going as part of our ongoing discussions. But for me, the word outstanding is the lower level of this second part of the criterion. Exemplary, I think, is pretty much clear as, you know, a shining example, highest level, not much like it. But I think where we get kind of have kind of trouble making decisions sometimes is thinking about what's outstanding. And to me, you know, outstanding obviously means it stands out. There's something different about the house. And this was why on the property on Royal Boulevard that we discussed last month, the question of what makes this Spanish colonial different than other Spanish colonials on the street or in the bigger neighborhood really became an issue. I often, when I get nominations like that, if there's a shred of information that there might have been someone significant, I'll kind of push the owners. I'll say, maybe we wait a month and maybe you do some more research. Maybe we look into this just to prove whether or not we can find out anything else about the house. And one of our problems, and I think the Commission's experienced this a number of times recently in some denials, is that we're usually talking about beautiful homes. And they're usually places that we would all be happy to live in. They're very nice. And we often feel bad. You know, when I'm writing a staff recommendation for denial, I'll call the owner first. I'll say, listen, I'm sorry, but, you know, this is where it panned out in my assessment. And I know the commissioners have often expressed that from the dais. And it's okay to do that, I think, but it's also something that we have to keep that kind of emotional level from making us want to put properties on the register. So in terms of, you know, and this is where I don't have any solid advice. I think we're just going to have to build kind of a culture based on precedent of how the Commission wants to interpret this criterion. But to me, something for it to be the minimal level to meet this, which would be to be outstanding, means it has to have some level of significant architectural detailing, materials, craftsmanship, whichever one of those parts of it that we see that really makes it different from the properties in the immediate area. And this is especially hard to do in, well, actually it's a little easier to do perhaps in historic districts, because in the districts we actually have a survey, so we can compare to the houses in the district, but that often isn't enough because the criterion's written to kind of look at a broader area, not just the 14 houses on Cottage Grove or the 30 houses on Royal Boulevard. But I think it's a start for us to start comparing within the district at least, so that we can say, okay, does this stand out? Is this different than what we've seen? And as you've noticed, you know, when I'm feeling that something doesn't do that, I kind of try to put that in writing. And one of the things I'm going to, well, I'll get to my recommendations for how I'll kind of deal with staff reports after I'm finished with some slides. But I think it's important for the Commission to always be thinking about findings. Like, when we're making a decision, we have to be able to say, we believe that this house meets the criterion because X, Y, Z. And I'm going to try to make that more clear in staff reports. I think the information is usually there, but when we actually are making a discussion and then finally a vote and making a motion and a vote, I think that has to be really out there to protect the commissions, which is one of the issues you were discussing at the conference. So I know that was kind of a repetition of things we've gone over. I just wanted to show a few examples of properties that have been designated in the last 4 or 5 years, and how some of them could be seen as establishing precedent, or just to raise some ideas for your thoughts and discussion. I think most of you know this house down at the bottom of Royal Boulevard, and in this case, when this house came to us, looking at it, it was like, wow, this has everything. This has a lot of different features that are typical of the Spanish colonial revival. It also has Mediterranean revival elements. It has a fountain, a loggia, a projecting porch. It has, this, and that. And that alone is going to say, like, okay, there's something going on here that doesn't look like other houses on Royal Boulevard or even necessarily in Rossmoyne. What was fun about this one was we also discovered that it was Ed Strangler Lewis's house. So you only need to be significant under one criteria. If this house was a dump and someone said, and Ed Strangler Lewis lived here, we'd have to start thinking, well, is he really that significant or not? But when we looked at them together, we said, well, no, it's very interesting. His career as a restaurateur in Glendale, his wrestling career when that was, a real sport, and he was the biggest star in the country. All of those things kind of coalesced, and I think it was a pretty clear-cut decision. Across the street from the Lewis House, we have the Wyan House, and this house has been considerably altered over the years. And if this came to me today, and I was writing a staff review, I would probably say that the enclosure of these terraces and balconies and some of the other changes I've seen when I've toured the house would really compromise some of the integrity that I mentioned before. But here we have, the fallback on doing the research, finding out who actually lived there, who built the place. It was Bob Wyan's home, Bob's Big Boy, one of Glendale's most important businesses. So that one becomes more clear. This is a house that was designated just before I started. This is 850 Cumberland, which the Commission reviewed not long ago for some proposals for changes to the house. But going back to the record for when this was nominated, the Commission, and this again is a beautiful house with lots of nice details, the Commission felt that it didn't meet Criterion D for architecture. The Commission actually was ready to vote this house down and deny the application, and I'm not sure exactly what happened. It must have happened at the Commission hearing, but the owner withdrew the nomination. They went back to the researcher they were working with, and I guess staff must have said, we need more. This isn't enough. And they actually did a fair amount of research about Mrs. Lombardi and her active civic life in Glendale and the committees and the work that she did for the city. And they said, no, this house is significant only under Criterion C, not under Criterion D, which was raised, of course, when the applicants came to make changes. And they said, but this isn't important for the architecture. And it's like, sorry, too late. You're on the register, so everything's important at that point. But this is the kind of situation where, for us to look at this house and no one is going to say this isn't a beautiful house. This isn't a house that has really nice Spanish colonial features. It happens to be on Cumberland Road in a neighborhood where there are tons of really good Spanish colonial revivals, and didn't quite make it. This is a house just off of Royal Boulevard on Imperial Drive. And this, again, is a beautiful house. We found, or the owners in the nomination found some early marketing materials for the Ross Moyne, the second phase of Ross Moyne when they were developing Royal Boulevard. And this house was featured in one of the engravings in the advertisement, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a more or less special house, but it kind of gave it a little more cachet, I thought. And when I was working on the nomination with the owners, I was like, you're in a neighborhood where it's going to be tough and you need to do more. They had come in saying that the house was owned by a person who was involved with Glendale Federal Savings. That's right. That's the kind of thing, let's explore that a little more. It turns out that Charles Wellman, who now the house is named after, was the executive vice president of Glendale Federal, which sometimes wouldn't be enough to be the vice president. He's not the founder of Glendale Federal. But through their research, they found out he did a tremendous amount to make Glendale Federal the success that it was, going from a little Glendale bank to a huge regional powerhouse. He was an advisor to President Kennedy on financial matters. He sat on the City Parking Commission, which again wouldn't quite be enough, but so all of this came together, and I was very comfortable nominating this under Criterion C, but the Commission also designated it under Criterion D, so it was kind of, again, one of these mixed designations. Same story with the Brower House. This was where the Reverend Brower, who was the minister at First Baptist Church for 75 years, I think. This is on Lawson Place. This was designated more for Reverend Brower's, based on the Commission's discussion, for his impact on the city, not only as the longest served Methodist or Baptist in the denomination's history, but also for feeding Glendale during the Depression with the orchard that he had planted on the side of the house. So it kind of told a lot of stories, as well as being a very nice example of Spanish colonial. And this is where things have gotten kind of sticky. And again, this is where I'm happy when the Commission disagrees with me, but I look back at this one as one where I really kind of still question, and but the house is on the Glendale Register now. But I just wanted to remind the commissioners that when we have additions made to houses, we sometimes lose what I would call the integrity of the property in terms of its original design conception and the use and the appearance it had during its period of construction and earlier significance. And this was an interesting commission discussion because the addition is over here on the left of the house. It's a beautifully done addition, and I think that's part of why the commission ended up supporting the nomination. The windows, though, except for this one up here, were aluminum slider windows.
Correct.
And a lot of times when we think about the Secretary of the Interior standards, they say that new additions, new work is supposed to be differentiated from the old work. Well, in the case of this addition, the main thing that differentiated it was the aluminum sliding windows, but the commission felt those were inappropriate and asked the owner to put in wood windows. So we now have kind of two levels of history removed from what the house was originally, and that's the kind of decision that I would, at staff level, I would really be working hard to kind of make kind of it clear why I felt a certain way about whether this should be listed or not based on the criteria and based on kind of integrity discussions. And of course the commission is able to vote. There's nothing that binds the commission to that discussion except the idea that I think we do need to be concerned, like I mentioned, about precedent. And then finally I just have a couple of other slides. All right, I think this is the final slide, and this is one where it shows that not all changes are necessarily a problem. We're looking at a house that, when we looked at it, we said this is up on Hillcroft Road, and we said this is kind of an exemplary and even unusual example of the Tudor revival, and had a lot of interesting architectural features going on that we're not used to seeing. If the commissioners remember, those who were with us at the time, there was a canopy over the driveway, kind of a canvas canopy. And everyone was like, oh, it's a magnificent house, but this canopy. And so the owners actually removed the canopy. It was a huge improvement. But what the commission did, and I think it's very realistic, most houses that we're going to look at have alterations. In general, when the alterations aren't visible to the public, it makes it easier to kind of make a finding that there's no loss to the public benefit of having a designated house. And this house had this big deck that was put on the back, and it was on a very steep site. There's a tall concrete column holding up the deck. Definitely unusual, a little bit visible from downhill, but not in a way that had a major impact on the house. And the commission decided that this deck wasn't a feature that was bad or detracted enough from the character of the house to not have it designated. And I think that's kind of one of the points I want to make is when we're looking at properties, we need to think, is this the highest and best example of a type? Is this kind of a case study for the future of how Glendale developed over the years? So the two things that I thought one thing just in terms of the issue of integrity, if a property is only being nominated under Criterion D, the architecture criterion, to me that raises the need for the integrity to be higher because we're talking about design and materials and the period taste that the house reflects. If a house like the Wellman House is truly significant because of its association with Charles Wellman, and the windows have been changed, but the house is still very recognizable, and it was Wellman's house, I think the commission may have more latitude to allow a lower level of integrity when the house has other criteria that it meets. And this is kind of consistent with general thinking in preservation land. Reading kind of the journals, integrity is a huge issue and very controversial. And over the years, integrity has become seen as something very elitist and very much like the early days of preservation when we're looking at Charleston or New Orleans and we're saying, oh my God, that wrought iron detail is so important to this property because of what it tells us. And it kind of privileges that sort of material integrity over cultural integrity. And so preservation lately has started moving more into, kind of having a more holistic assessment of all of these aspects that kind of come to form the properties that we might be designating. So integrity is something that I think we have to have sort of a floating kind of indicator for. But the two things that I'd like to do at staff level in my reports, and I'm hoping part of your discussion you can tell me if you think these are good ideas and if you have any other ideas. In the section where I always call out alterations, and it's part of the application that we know where the alterations are, and we often are wondering, are they permitted? Do they have an impact on the character of the house? I'm going to kind of call it more of an integrity, we'll talk about alterations and then kind of have a staff level integrity assessment. One of the things that we were fortunate to have in our historic district reports, like for the house from last month on Royal Boulevard, was an integrity assessment from our resource consultant. And that basically said that the integrity was good rather than excellent because the garage had been added and the decks had been changed and played with them. So looking from the street, they were able to say it wasn't an excellent, it didn't have excellent integrity, it had good integrity. For me, that was a red flag that if this is only being nominated under the architecture criterion, maybe we need to think about it more carefully. Most properties aren't going to be nominated in historic districts, so I'll have to make a staff level assessment for that, just using kind of professional standards similar to what the consultants do. And then the other thing I'll try to do in my findings is if we're nominating something for the second part of Criterion D, saying something's outstanding or exemplary, I'm going to try to pull out language that, in my staff opinion, is why I'm either supportive or not of a certain application. And then those are points that the Commission can specifically discuss and perhaps use in a motion if you're voting one way or the other. That's one way I think I can make the staff reports a little more clear to help with this kind of discussion. That's all I've got. I don't know if Alan has thoughts or commissioners.
Commissioners?
I have a couple of questions, actually. In the past, going back to the criteria C for the significance of the person, would have had to been on past seminars that I've taken, it would have had to been the peak time of the individual who lived in that house, peak time of his career. That's what I've learned.
To me that's somewhat important. And if, for example, the Lewis house, Ed Strangler Lewis never wrestled when he lived in Glendale. He was long retired after his career was over. But when he moved to Glendale, he opened a restaurant that became kind of an attraction, and people would come visit Glendale so that they could see Strangler Lewis's, he'd come around and greet people at their tables. So he became kind of a local figure. So I tend to think that there needs to be some overlap in that, and that changes depending on the significance of the person. So if it's someone who's locally significant as a businessman, Charles Wellman lived in the house on Imperial just for I think 5 or 6 years, but those were some of the peak years where Glendale Federal went from 0 to 60 over that time. He was probably involved, I assume, somewhat closely in Glendale Federal's construction on Brand, the new building. So yeah, and I don't think there's a set answer to that. I think we'd have to weigh it depending on the situation.
Because we had a while back when I first joined the commission, I think your other colleague brought a consultant historian that talked about the significance of the person itself. How do you define the significance of the person? And they concentrated on that particular, the significance of the person who lived in the house during his career and the contribution to the city. Mm-hmm. And I've been looking at it in that way. And what you're telling me is we should keep it a little more in a broader...
Yeah, generally, to be on the National Register for significance with a historic person, the site is supposed to be the place that is best associated with that person's period or significant achievements. So if it's Thomas Edison, it's not the house he was born in as a boy, but it's the laboratory where he did his inventions. But if his boyhood house happened to be in Glendale, and we were so proud that we were the boyhood home of Thomas Edison, I think as a city we would be within our, within good practice to designate that house.
The reason I'm asking that question, because a while back, I don't know if it was Manhattan, up in La Crescenta area, where the owner...
Go house?
Right off the, I think, Verdugo, or was it?
I think you're maybe thinking of the property next to the Bonetto house that the commission reviewed.
Yeah, there was a feed and farm supplier.
There was some remnant of their well or something.
The home was not really significant. It was a kind of a kit home that was done, and the owner started that business and lived in that house over 60 years.
Yeah, that was the Bonetto house.
The Bonetto house,
that,
yes.
I'm not positive. You might know, Mike. I think that was designated just under
for the
Criterion C,
significant, not for the
I
architecture.
think so.
Right, yes.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you another question. What do other cities do pertaining to the contributors when it comes to designations?
Excuse me?
What do other cities do? What other cities do when you have contributors in a district? How do they apply if somebody comes and says, we want it to be designated?
During the time I worked for the LA Conservancy, I don't remember that coming up. although it seems that they would do something similar to what we do. It's two separate sets of criteria to be a historic district or to be individually designated.
Okay.
So they would apply, like we do, the individual designation. The difference is, in Los Angeles, the Mills Act is available to contributors in historic districts, and here it isn't. And since the Mills Act really drives a lot of our nominations, people who live in historic districts aren't going to be getting the tax benefit just by being in the historic district. So there's kind of an extra motivation for them to try to get on the register. And I think that's where we're seeing that's where, for me, it's really hard to kind of separate some of these houses.
Real different. Last question I had, going back to alterations. Now, like you said, the state standards, SHPO, when you do an alteration or addition, should be differentiated, even with a break or some other treatment, to show the period of that change. Now, in the last house that we reviewed, we had some issues with it. How are we going to judge that when the state SHPO and we go by that, and then the nation is going by that, make it different a little bit?
Yeah, and I think we have two issues. It's one, is the house coming to us with an addition that's already there, or are we reviewing a designated house where we have design authority over how the addition's made? In general, we're not going to see a lot of modern additions on Spanish colonials, and that's probably a good thing. So, and in general, the preservation community is moving away from a strict interpretation of the Secretary's standards for that. There's a sense that that was driven by, for aesthetic reasons, by kind of a modernist impulse from the 50s and 60s through the 70s. And I tend to agree that the addition needs to be differentiated in some physical way.
Some break or some sort.
Separate, whether it's a break or something, so that, and there's another part of the Secretary's standards that says, to meet the standards, the addition needs to be able to be removed without affecting the eligibility of what's left, the original part of the building.
Right.
And that's always probably doable in most situations, but that's part of it. And I think that's the kind of thing we're not going to be able to answer. It's going to be kind of case by case. Okay. My tendency for staff, and this is where I just wanted to share my thinking when I'm going through this. If the addition is on the front, if it's a prominent addition seen from the street, my tendency, even if it's well designed, would be to recommend denial. Yeah. But again, I want to leave myself an out in case there are other aspects that kind of over. Yeah.
I think an interesting counterpoint to that point of view would be the Seeley's building when that came forward for nomination. It came forward after a series of alterations. The Seeley building is, in fact, I think 3, if not 4, separate structures.
Three different alterations.
3 separate time periods. And in fact, the original building, which is the piece at the corner, was in fact altered by one of the additions. So part of the history of that building is actually, it's kind of collage of different pieces of 3 separate structures that make up the Seeley's building as we know it today. So that there was actually an interesting discussion at the commission at that time, if I remember, about that issue.
Yeah. Next time I will share some pictures from Grand Rapids where they've taken old buildings and added totally modern elements to it, whether it was on the roof or on the side or entries or. But I'll discuss that next time. Thank you very much, Jay. I think that was very. Because I wanted to hear that discussion. Really, because it helps us, make better judgments on, especially, I think we're going to start getting some additions, alterations, and we are getting a number of designations who have additions done to it, and you've showed some examples there.
Yeah, it seems almost, the Rice House is actually one of the few that doesn't have anything. And I think it's more where are the additions? Is it backyard landscaping versus is it another wing put onto the property? For example, when we redid the survey for Ardeven Highlands, the consultant looked at the Cumberland Heights survey that had been done about 4 or 5 years earlier, and we found a house that was a kind of a Monterey revival, not a Spanish, more of an English kind of Monterey revival, and it had a wing attached to one side, so it was a 2-story volume that was the historic body of the house and a 1-story wing stretching out to the side, very much in keeping with colonial architecture, and you see additions like that all the time. The original survey said that house is a non-contributor because of this addition. when we were looking at it with new eyes and a new group of consultants, we were all like, no, that house is still there, and this addition, while it has changed the kind of proportions and aspects of the site, it didn't take it down as a non-contributor. The question would be if I saw that as a Glendale Register nomination. Usually with additions, you have to look at them and say, has the addition acquired significance in its own right over time? And if it's become a feature that's just completely meshed with the property, it was very well designed and detailed at the time, you might say, yes, that's part of the property's history. Like Alan said, it's a history of changes, and those have become significant in a way. But, you know, for a contributor in a district, which is a lower threshold, we all thought, like, oh, no, that should definitely be a contributor, so...
Because I think also in some of these seminars, they talk about what you just said exactly. We should not even further touch those things because it shows the home period and the addition that was done to it. It shows the change over time. For example, you know, a lot of homes that were built in the 20s or 30s, they came and attached the porte-cochere like a carport right next to it, and over time the whole thing blended. It became one. You know, you couldn't really tell. You could tell the change, but you couldn't really tell whether it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago because it was kind of part of the whole original home, and they felt that you know, that's part of the house. You know, some of them I don't agree sometimes, but everything should be judged the way it is at that time. But I think there's some changes that kind of blend in with the home without showing, oh, I'm an addition, you know. And I think we need to look at that also when we review these things. Thank you.
Can I offer a thought? When you were talking about the integrity assessment and weighing the outstanding versus exemplary, part of what was my challenge with the Royal Boulevard home was if it's a contributor, but it's only got a good rating, how do you say that then that fits the exemplary example? But it might be helpful when those come up in the district, like if you could show us a picture of the Royal Boulevard houses in that district that got an excellent rating, so we'd have something to compare and contrast.
Great idea.
That would be, I think, really helpful for us to then determine, does it raise to that level of exemplary or outstanding, especially if there's some challenges with the modifications or alterations.
And I could also add that to the staff report so that when you go visit the site,
That'd be
you'll have
great.
a list of addresses and you can
That'd
look
be
at
great.
the problem with that, though. I think it's a great idea, but you're looking again at a limited pool
Yes.
in a small survey area sometimes. As we get bigger historic districts, once we look at Ross Moyne, almost all of the Ross Moyne neighborhood will have been surveyed at that point, so we'll have a better idea.
Yeah.
But okay.
Any other thoughts or comments?
No, I really like your idea of taking a kind of a regulatory structure to the report so that it makes it easier to feed the reviewer the ease of making a decision based on the criteria. So the idea of having a section devoted to alterations around the discussion of meeting the criteria, and then a section supporting why or why not specific criteria are met. And obviously some are going to be very obviously not met, but if there's any controversy around whether something meets a specific criteria, that you would elaborate on that. I think that's a really good idea. One example that always jumps out in my mind is Wyan House, because that house was the childhood home of Bob Wyan. Clearly, you know, he didn't do anything as a child other than live there and hopefully be happy, but
May have had his first hamburger there.
maybe he was inspired to go into the burger business. But I always feel like maybe in the past, when we didn't have the protections that we have today, there may have been a desire to protect houses under the landmark ordinance when the option of historic districting wasn't as obvious or even legally
Available,
possible. And in that case, I feel like that's a good example of going into an extreme, because we basically had destroyed much of the Bob's Big Boy legacy. And so even with a very unintegral house, it was worth landmarking for that reason alone. So. So thank you. That was a really good discussion and really helped clarify things in my mind.
If I may make another suggestion to the commission and to Jay, something Jay and I have actually discussed is perhaps we could also consider putting in draft motions as part of the staff reports that would include some of the findings Jay has discussed. If you review any of the council reports before the council meets, there's very often a draft motion. And in some cases, it's very detailed. They find such and such based on the following criteria and the following whereases. And other times, if they're engaged in a more open-ended discussion, it sometimes just says the council moves that staff shall do blank, and then they fill it in at the hearing.
Sometimes there are even two draft motions, one in support and one denial. So.
Right. And so perhaps in some of these cases, we could actually put together a draft motion that says the commission recommends based on the following criteria and findings.
Maybe that could include also the Mills Act information, meaning I think sometimes in your staff report, I review the Mills Act and it indicates things that they will be doing as part of their contract. If you feel necessary, you could draft that in so we also make the nomination with that. Like, for instance, the Romulus House mentioned that the modern home, I think Romulus House, mentioned redoing one of the exterior balconies, I think the lower level. And as we walked on it,
Yeah, it was very flimsy.
definitely in need. I mean, almost scary to walk on it. So I think like things like that, then, as noted, we would have the assurance that those things would be in the contract if we read about it and thought it was necessary.
And what I could also do, and I'm just thinking of this as kind of a separate issue, when we prepare the Mills Act contracts usually at the beginning of November and group them all together. I could prepare them for your review, and then you'll see, that's where I'll start the chart for that year of all of the timeline items, so we can at least look at that point, and then if you had any memories of things that I missed or anything,
That'd be perfect.
we could do it before the contract's finalized. So.
Great. Anything else?
Anything else? Not from me.
And I guess we would move to adjournment.
Thank you.
We need to.
Make a motion to adjourn.
What was this? Yeah, we don't have to do that
don't have
anymore.
to.
Just need a motion in a second.
Okay.
Adjourned.